Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to James Wade about Hollow Out the Dark. James is a two-time Spur-winning, award-winning author and the youngest recipient of that award. Is that correct?
The youngest two-timer, yes, sir.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Welcome, James.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Thank you. I agree. I feel the same way. I was absolutely blown away by the lyricism in your writing. It's an art, and I mean that in the highest praise and compliment, because a full-on description, or what I would call lyricism, I think it's such a true, unique art. Have you always been a lyrical writer?
I have, in the sense that I've always aspired to it, and I still don't know that I've got it quite down the way that, some of my heroes did. But yeah, I've always found as a reader and a thinker that when I see writing that does have that kind of, aura of poetry around it and lyricism, I gravitate towards it. And there is something artistic about it, something very craft oriented, that it just shows the time and thought that was put into every word of every sentence, down at just the almost the atom level, right?
Yes,
and so I've always tried to write that way.
So let's talk a little bit about your process. So do you write bare bones and then go back and add some of the lyricism, or does the lyricism simply come out of you from putting pen to paper or typing on a keyboard?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think the lyricism comes first, to be honest. And I know I've been told many times you shouldn't write from theme out, but I tend to do that. I carry a little notebook with me. I mean, it's kind of a cliche thing, but I carry a little notebook everywhere. And if I see the trees move a certain way in the wind, I'll take note of it, and just kind of the everyday little moments of lyricism that happen in our lives, right? It's it's tough to be alive, man. So you gotta find those little moments of beauty and those little moments of poetry. And so I try to capture that, and then sometimes out of that grows a theme for a novel, and then out of that theme grow the characters, and then out of the characters grow the story. And so I kind of, I think that's probably a little backwards than the way a lot of writers do it, but it's what's kind of worked for me, and I can't help but do it that way.
Well, and I love that, James, because every writer has a different approach to writing. I know I talked to Jane Harper, who says she knows what the end of her novel is, and she works backwards on an outline. She sits down and she writes the entire novel straight through from beginning to end because she has worked her model backwards. And I was like, wow. And then talking to some authors who just say, oh, I don't outline anything. It's always just what I'm feeling at the moment. And every author has a different approach to how they go to it.
Yeah, I mean, I do an outline for every novel, and one of these days I'm actually going to write the novel based on the outline. But so far, I just I've said before that outlines are like bones, and bones can break. Well, mine shatter every time, and I don't think I've had a single novel that has ever come out looking anything like the outline did. But you get into it, and you find certain things to be feel more true maybe than they did, and you change it, and the characters want to make you change it, and it just I always think I know where it's going to end, and then it usually ends somewhere else, and you just kind of got to go with it.
Well, and I think life does that sometimes as well. Just the simplicity of life. Maybe you set out. I was pre-med when I started college, and then I realized I wasn't nearly as smart as I thought I was. So that pre-med business went right out the window. And it turns out I would have had a really bad bedside manner because I'm like, I don't have a lot of empathy and sympathy for people. I'm just not that nice, James. So I wouldn't have been
I don't believe that at all.
I feel like I'm a nice person, but I'm impatient a lot of times with
all
people.
Right.
I'm like, okay, you gotta move this along,
Yeah, I understand.
So, well, and speaking, so I'm always trying to insert myself. So, speaking of that, I think there's a bit of that in your story as well. You've some characters who are in a hurry to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
from point A to point B, and then you've characters who couldn't care less where point B is. So, in writing those, what appeals to you? Do these characters form themselves?
Well, it's a good point that you make about the characters having different kind of they're operating on different frequencies, right? And when you have characters that are different like that and that have either different goals or some of the characters maybe no goals at all, and when those characters bump up against one another, it creates just a natural tension. And you want that on the page. You want there to be tension between the characters that the reader can kind of makes them hold their breath a little bit as to what's going to happen. And yeah, I mean, it's a lot, to use your words, it's a lot like life, man. There's all kinds of different people, and when you get them all kind of operating in the same vicinity, there tends to be some overlap that that rubs the wrong way, and so you just want to explore kind of the depth of every character and every different person. I mean, I write some pretty bad folks, but at the same time, I try my best to explore their history and their background to where I mean, there is good and evil, but I really find it hard to believe that folks are just born evil, right? Like we all have trauma and things that we endured in the past that kind of shaped us in certain ways, and it's not that you can't take personal responsibility, but at the same time, there has to be a balance and an empathy. And so, yeah, when I'm writing my characters, I want them all to be well-rounded, despite kind of operating on different frequencies, having different moral codes and different journeys that they're on.
So, one of the things I'm always interested in is generational trauma. And so you have a historic novel that is within reason set in 1932. There's some flashbacks to the late like 1918 and 1917. And of course that's during World War One. And I think that we of our generation really haven't been as influenced by war as someone like our grandparents' age. So I think that reading that, I began to see some things about the characters that you've created and how that generational trauma forms their direction in life. And as you say, we can take personal responsibility, but it's also a little difficult when you're thrown into situations that you can't control. And I think if you've been off to war, how do you come home and just punch a time clock?
Yeah. Well, it's a great point, because there's two things that are somehow simultaneously true, right? Which is, one, we have definitely not been impacted by war the way that our ancestors were. And there's a million degrees to that. I mean, I have old war ration cards from my grandparents where, you got to check how much sugar you've had this month and all those things. So, yeah, we've come a long way since then. And yet at the same time, I'm writing these characters and they're coming, it's in the Great Depression. So we've got this economic hardship. They're coming out of a pandemic with the Spanish flu that's impacted everybody. And they're having a tough time trusting a lot of their, government, elected officials, all these things. And I'm going, well, that doesn't sound all that different, right, than some of the things that we do. So you have these two things that are simultaneously true, which is, one, humanity has not changed that much in terms of the things that we come up against, the things, searching for a purpose and having some of the, the more domestic hardships that we face. And then at the same time, to your original point, my goodness, there's wars all over the world, but if we want to ignore them, we can. Right? It's never been easier to access information, and yet it's never been easier to ignore it, which is just bizarre in my mind. It's these extremes, and I think that's the key, is that everything now is so extreme. There is very little room for nuance or for balance or for slowing down, and so yeah, I mean, I go back and forth, not on how I feel, but on how I portray personal responsibility versus generational trauma, because it's just so nuanced, right? And people want to act like we've become who we are because of the choices we made, and that's true to a varying degree. But my goodness, I mean, there are statistically or percentage wise, if you tell me where you were born and what political party your parents were a part of, and maybe even down to what neighborhood you grew up in, I can make assumptions about you, right? And 9 times out of 10, those assumptions are going to be true. So how can we then say that like we've created ourselves as people? And that's something that is it's fascinating to me, and also something a lot of people don't really want to talk about, right? They want to think that they've had done it all themselves, and
That's right.
because it's a little unnerving to think maybe we don't have as much control over everything, as we do. And that's something that obviously my characters have to confront in the novel, is like, how much can I really control outside circumstances?
Well, and one of the things we talked a little bit before we recorded, this book has a lot of bootlegging in it. And I was telling James that I grew up in a little village in eastern North Carolina, and I knew who the bootlegger was. Everyone knew who it was. And, Mr. Burt Wilson was a very nice man. He was, he went to church. He was Christian according to the standards, but he was a lawbreaker according to the other set of standards. And I find that in reading Hollow Out the Dark and books similar to this, I get excited about the fact that we see people who recognize who everyone else is. They just decide to put blinders on where it's convenient for them. And you do have to sort of pick a side at some point, especially a book set in the Depression era, because there was a whole lot of right and wrong and very little in between.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the whole crux of the book, is about how you prioritize your morality. And that's a really tough thing to do at any point, but certainly when things are desperate the way that they were in that time period, and certainly in rural communities. The paper mill has shut down, people are out of jobs, it's cold, you're hungry, your family's sick. Like you have to adjust that moral code, right? And that's what our characters are kind of struggling with. And I just always find those moral conundrums, as both a reader and a thinker and a writer, to be one of the most interesting things that you can explore.
I agree. A friend of mine says that with some characters, she notices that their moral compass, their true north, is slightly askew, but to them, it's not slightly askew because it's where they are in their lane or in their life. And something that was so small that just sort of struck me so big was the fact that in Ammon's Bible, his mother wrote, "Never stray." And I think to myself, well, that's a really nice thing, but that's such a high level of morality to try to attain, because we all have had a moment in life where we weren't the most honest person or the most giving or helpful person. But that little admonition of never stray is just an impossibility. There's no such thing as perfection.
Well, that's exactly right, and you hit the nail on the head, because it's such a high standard and we feel it kind of crushing Eamon throughout the novel, right?
Yes.
He wants so badly to be righteous and to always do the right thing, but then as circumstances arise, he kind of starts to wonder, what is the right thing, and what am I doing, and is my rigidities hurting my family, and all these things. But yeah, you're absolutely right when you say that as your moral compass turns a little bit or shifts a little bit, you don't realize it.
No.
You think that you're doing the right thing. I mean, there are very few instances in our lives, even ones that maybe now we're not proud of or now we regret, where at the time we justified it or rationalized it, right, in a way that was like, no, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing or what I have to be doing. And you very much believe yourself at every age, right? I am not the person I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But when I was that person, I very much believe this is who I am. This is who I'll always be. You don't feel yourself changing, and again, that's just such a fascinating part of being alive, right?
Totally agree. Totally agree. And I think it's, it is, as you say, it is who we are. It's where we are in life. And my truth now isn't what it was 20 or 30 years ago, because my goals now aren't what they were 20 or 30 years ago. I have different things I want to achieve in life at this point. Hell, sometimes it's just getting up.
Right. Well, so listen, Dan, that is really what I wanted to explore with Hollow Out the Dark. Even the title, Hollow Out the Dark, it's like this call to action, right? When we're kids, we have this idea of what life is going to be, right? Like, and it's going to be this wonderful, beautiful thing. And when we're adults, we can do whatever we want. And like, you don't think about death. You don't think about purpose. Like, you know that, no, there's a purpose, but we'll find it later, and everything's going to be great at the next chapter. And so I've always written novels that kind of explore that moment when we have a loss of innocence or a coming of age. But what I wanted to do with this novel is our characters have already gone through that for the most part. Like you mentioned, they've gone through the traumatic, war and plague and death and all these things. They realize that the world is not what they thought it was when they were children. So now, what do? How do we live with that? Do we curl up and just let it overwhelm us, or do we kind of take a ignorance is bliss point of view and just ignore everything? Or is there a third option that again is kind of more balanced or nuanced, where we say, look, I see the darkness, I see these things that are wrong, I acknowledge them, but I'm going to find a way to exist within that, and if not be happy, then at least be whole, right? And at least be my own person. And it's a challenging thing to do. It was challenging then, it's challenging now. I mean, my goodness, we hear about everything that's wrong 24/7 all the time, and it can be so much, but it's still up to us to try to find a way to exist within that. And I found that if you just put blinders on and don't listen to any of it, well, then you're not whole. But at the same time, if you allow it to every little thing to overwhelm you, then it's debilitating. And so I struggle with it, but I try so hard to find that balance where I'm like, okay, here's what is wrong, but here's how I can exist alongside it and try my best to make things right where I can, and to at least, if not be at peace, then just be at a point of relative acceptance of where we are in the world when something just seems terrible, which it does often, but we have to live with it.
That's right. I mean, I have not a very nice thing that I say in business wise. If you're like an ostrich and you bury your head in the sand, it's only your butt up in the air. I mean, come on now. And it's a little crude, but it's very true. You can't just ignore life. I mean, life is ever evolving. So one thing that I will say that I hope this comes as a compliment, but you write poverty very well as well. And I think in all of life, I live in Los Angeles. I moved away from Eastern North Carolina. I've lived in a lot of large cities in my life. I am different than most people. I think when you're in poverty or you're impoverished, it's hard to get out. It's hard to really see, okay, I can get on a train and go away like Sarah does. That's a very rare thing. I find that a lot of people I grew up with are still in the exact same position they were 40 years ago. And they're complaining about the exact same things they were complaining about 40 years ago. I understand they didn't get out, so to speak. I think getting out is one of the most difficult things in life. I find that, so when I read characters who desperately want out, but can't figure out how to get out, I understand it. And I felt like you did such a wonderful job with that. Some characters had hope, and then there were some characters who had no hope. And unfortunately in life, there are people that don't have hope. We hope everyone does, but it doesn't always work out that way. Is that a bit debilitating for you to write? And because you have to get into some dark space to be able to pull that off, James.
Yeah, my wife calls it book brain when I come out of the office and I just kind of have this glazed and depressed look. It's twofold. On the personal side, therapy is expensive and I have terrible insurance. And so, so writing is certainly an outlet for some of my, darker and more complicated thoughts, right? And I've been told many times that my books are very dark with glimmers of hope, right? And that is kind of, again, to take it back to just feeling true of life and representative of life. I mean, I think that can be true a lot of the time, right? Is things can seem very dark, but you can almost always find some glimmer of hope, except when you can't. And you point that out. There are folks where that hope just doesn't exist. And we have several characters in Hollow Out the Dark who, I think of Adeline Brookshire, who was one of my favorite characters in the novel to write, but just because she was so desperate to leave, and get out of East Texas, and she never did. She just couldn't do it, and that happens so often, right? So it's not accurate, it's not true to just have these characters that fulfill all their dreams, right? And it was not of her own doing. It was outside circumstances. But when you have somebody like Sarah that does get out, it's a very special thing. It's very and
Yes.
it took many people in her life encouraging her to do that, right? And that's how I feel. I mean, I was born in a trailer in East Texas, and were it not for the sacrifices of my mother and other people around me, there's no way that I'm sitting here, because to your point, it is one of the toughest things when you are not born into, we talk about nepotism and nepo babies and all that, but when
Yes.
you're
Yes.
not when you're not born into that stuff, man, it's tough to get there. It really is, and you do have to work a little bit harder, but you also have to have a lot of help. I mean, again, it goes back to everybody wants to think that they've got where they are on their own, and it's not that you didn't make good decisions or that you didn't work hard, but you had help. You just because you absolutely have to. And so anybody in this novel that has a happy ending, it's because they had help.
Yes, and I will also say that you give us, sorry, you've given some of the characters situations where they've asked for help and help was refused.
That's right.
And having grown up in a rural setting, I understand that very concept. We often think that, oh, well, if you just ask for a helping hand, someone will give it to you. That's not always the case. And so I felt like that was such a truism that you brought for some of your characters, and the fact that some of them really did want to get out, but circumstance simply kept it so they could not get out.
Yeah, I'm. This is an old adage, but I'm not a pessimist, Dan. I'm a realist, and I want to reflect that in my fiction because that's the way I think, right? I'm not.
Mhm.
I'm not walking around just cynical and angry all the time. Some people meet me and they kind of are a little disappointed that I'm somewhat jovial. But but that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge, the things about my writing that exist that are dark and that are true. I mean, it's just, I'll say it again. It's just real and it's just true. And I don't know another way to write. It would feel very dishonest if I didn't have these characters exist in situations that are true to history, that are true to modern day. I mean, it just is what it is. And as a reader, when I read books that feel untrue, it takes me out of it immediately, and those could be, there's room for every book. And I love a beach read as much as anybody and good escapist fiction. I understand, people, the world's tough enough, right? And maybe they don't want that in their fiction. There are plenty of books out there for them. But for me, just what I've always been drawn to is that realism and that portrayal of the difficulties of life in a way that is earnest and a way that looks it straight in the eye. I think if we can look it straight in the eye and say, look, I'm aware that there's darkness, but guess what? I'm going to turn you into poetry right now. And that's what we're going to do.
Well, and because of your lyricism, you give us something that's really dark and without hope in a lot of places. But your lyricism elevates that out of that, James. When the tree branch, there's several tree branches that crack under the weight of ice. I could hear it. I could feel it. You could feel the cold. I had forgotten, but you reminded, of a cabin. So the cabin is rarely ever secure back in the day. Wind was always getting under the door, around the windows, wherever it was. That's something that the majority of us do not face in today's world. Whether you grew up in a mobile home or an apartment or a house, most everything is, the wind doesn't get in like it used to get in. And you give us, I mean, I could feel the bite of the wind, and that was just so wonderful.
Yeah, I love exploring setting and flora and fauna and nature and all that, from a poetic standpoint, just because I've always been drawn to it, but also from a metaphorical state, right? The entire novel takes place over the course of the winter, and it feels cold and
Mhm.
claustrophobic, and the like you say, the trees and the branches are cracking under the weight of the ice and the weight of the cold, and we feel our characters bending in that same manner, and we're waiting for them to crack. And so I like to use setting as a character itself, and make it part of the plot and part of the story. I think it's a richer reading experience that way.
And then, so for a little bit of humor, I just love the fact that Moss names his pigs.
Look, when we're gonna talk about things that are as dark and as you can be as depressing as some of the stuff that we get into in this novel, you've got to have a little bit of levity in there as well, right? And not just to give the reader a break, but also because going back to what's truthful. I mean, my goodness, think of some of the jokes we've laughed at in our lives, right? And think of some of the decisions we make, even when we get horrible news. We find ways to laugh, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about humanity is that we can laugh even in the face of some really dark stuff. And yes, Moss is absolutely one of my favorite characters. He names the pigs after celebrities of the time, which was a fun thing to research, kind of who the it people were, in the teens and 20s. But yeah, I mean, you got to have that stuff. Again, it just makes for a richer reading experience.
It does. And one character says, stop naming the pigs. But my mother grew up on a farm, and you didn't name the animals because you were going to eat them eventually. So if you named them, you got attached to them. So most of the animals they raised never had a name because you bond with the animal, and that's not a good thing if the animal's going to be headed for slaughter eventually.
That's right. That's why Moss only names the ones that he lets in his house. But throughout the course of the novel, he's letting more and more come in. Anyway. I think he says, "Times is tough, pigs is warm." And so he's doing what he's got to do to get by too.
That's right. I love it. Again, the book is called Hollow Out the Dark. It's by James Wade. It is so wonderful. James, do you have a website or a social media you'd like to share?
I do. My website is just jameswadewriter.com, but you got to add the writer, or else there's a British dart player named James Wade, who I get some of his fan mail sometimes, and I have to send it back and just say I'm sorry, but I'm garbage at darts, and my British accent's pretty bad. But follow me on Instagram. That's where I'm the most active. It's just at James Wade Writer. And we try to put some fun stuff up there for anybody that's following along.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.